Hey everybody, this is Nevin Gusak, your host for the Populist Patriot. It's been a while since I've done one of these solo live streams, but I am back. Herschel and I had some shows. We had some really good guests for the Populist Roundtable for the previous episodes of the show. But I'm back, and with a quite a backlog of interesting things that I've been finding in books that I've read, some Facebook posts, authored by communists that kind of let the cat out of the bag on their true intentions for the United States. So I figured I'd kind of go over some things. That's why I call it odds and ends. It's historical odds and ends. These historical odds and ends, as well as some current news items on domestic security and national security, helps us understand what the heck is going on in this world and the threats posed to our republic. So we're going to start her off today. I got to go through several zip files here. So let me see what I can find here. Let us see. So I'm going to go into one where I found a very interesting post. This was on the hardline Stalinist Caleb Malpin's website, and it was very interesting. There was this gentleman, let me try and increase the size here of the photo I took. So his name was David Rao, and he titled this post, Nixon in China. And what was very interesting about this post, it kind of reveals really why China, from a communist point of view, so-called opened up to the United States and the capitalists that, of course, that they hated but used. So he wrote this very interesting passage. Nixon's change from virulent anti-communist to the American leader who took the first step in improving Sino-American relations led to a new political adage. Only Nixon could go to China. In the winter of 1972, a mere 4 months before the June 17th break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Washington D.C. Watergate office, Richard Nixon was at the height of his presidency. The diplomat of the Western world with liberal and conservative newspapers at the time comparing him to FDR and Lincoln. The U.S. ruling class, smug in their exceptionalism, bet that this bold move on the part of Nixon and the greatest superpower on the planet would break the Marxist-Leninist hold on China. That bilateral trade in U.S. capitalism would liberalize China into the American mold. That eventually all of Asia would be secured as a Western playground, as the city of Hong Kong, the islands of Japan, the Philippines, and Guam were. Just reading this because I took screenshots of it, so you'll have to bear with me. Where are we today in 2021? It can no longer be denied that socialism with Chinese characteristics, that's the name for Chinese communism, and the resolve of the workers in the People's Republic of China were the longer and smarter bet. So again, where are we today in 2021? It can no longer be denied that socialism with Chinese characteristics and the resolve of the workers, meaning the Communist Party, that's a euphemism, in the People's Republic of China were the longer and smarter bet. Well, look what's going on in the United States. We've sapped our industrial strength to other countries in the world, and under the control of internationalist globalists in the political class and in the business community, well, yeah, we gave China everything. It's not just from Communist Party manipulating the Chinese Communist Party and its agents manipulating the greedy, the American business community. We did it to ourselves. We had control over it. But instead, we allow capitalists to control our political system, and this is the shit that happens as a result. What's too easily, going back to reading the passage, what's too easily forgotten by Americans as they reached this propaganda piece from the Nixon Library Films Archives. In the Chinese side of events of 1972 and the historical and material realities of the two nations that seemed poised against each other today in 2021. Decades ago, while the US was beginning to lick its wounds over its impending imperialist defeat in Vietnam and veteran civil rights and anti-war student demonstrations were in everyday occurrence, the Chinese, via their nation study and understanding of Marxist theory of capitalism, they saw the future continued crisis of Western private capitalism under US leadership. So again, they saw the future continued crisis of Western private capitalism under US leadership. The USA, which was an arrogant, blundering paper tiger empire since 1945, after using the atomic bomb on Japan and then taking over as the main empire from the last remains of the European powers. The Chinese, in like a karate move of using your opponent's weight, strength, and mostly ignorance against them. The Communist Party of China under Mao and then Deng Xiaoping exploited the inherent greed of the U.S. capitalist class in the 1970s and 1980s. After the multi-trillion-dollar U.S. defeat of its imperialist projects in Korea and Vietnam, to hem in China and open Asian markets to Western domination in the subsequent 1970s recession and oil embargo. So again, we got to read this again, because this is really, 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 really important. We don't know whether the CPC's leadership coincidentally chose a fortunate time or whether it was deliberately planned out, but the 70s and the 80s were marked by violent crises of capitalism in the West, fall in the general rate of profit in the US and Europe. These capitalist crises forced the liberalization of trade and capital movements so that capital could move elsewhere to find cheaper labor in order to restore profit levels for the greedy Western capitalist class. All of the Western capitalist world was looking for a new place to move its industry. And what miraculously happened around that time? A country with 1 billion people, along with brand new infrastructure developed under Mao and the CPC from 1949 to 1976, suddenly opened up. This was convenient, but for which future society? A Western private capitalist society that's been clearly in repeated crisis since the 1970s, where the middle class has been hollowed out by the Western oligarchs' control of the US and NATO nation systems of government, all under neoliberal capitalist privatization policies. Or convenient for a socialist market nation that's clearly today in 2021, post the pandemic, besting the USA. So there you go. There we go. And I want to repeat this again. The CPC, Communist Party of China, under Mao and then Deng Xiaoping, exploited the inherent greed of the US capitalist class in the 1970s and 1980s. There you go. This is written by a communist. See, communists know how to exploit the greed of Western capitalists, of American capitalists, of American conservatives, and American market fundamentalists and corporations. That's, again, just put another penny in the bucket. More proof that communists use the greed and corporate sociopathy of our private sector oligarchs to ultimately hang capitalism and freedom. What else is new? Now, another interesting Facebook post. This is by the Brazilian expatriate conservative philosopher and intellectual, a rather colorful character, Olavo de Carvalho, and he is sort of the father of modern Brazilian anti-communism. He, whether you agree with him or not, he definitely has a sharp intellect and a staunch anti-globalist and a staunch anti-communist. And he posted a very revealing post that really is spot on. He said, one of the thousands of things I learned from A. James Gregor, he was a political scientist and actually a very good scholar on Italian fascism. And Carvalho wrote, populism is to seek support from popular masses. But since every political movement necessarily seeks that support, to call one of them a populist is to say absolutely nothing. And I think this is absolutely correct, because the term populism has been vastly overused and it's been dumbed down. Why? Because Jair Bolsonaro is called a populist, Donald Trump is called a populist, Boris Johnson is called a populist, even libertarians are called populists. These are not populists because they're not implementing they did not entirely implement policies that benefited average workers. They tended to govern in the interests of the employers and the private sector oligarchs. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. I mean, it doesn't mean that on this show we disagree with everything that Bolsonaro or Trump supported or implemented in policies. But when you take them as an aggregate whole, the policies of the likes of Boris Johnson or Jair Bolsonaro or Donald Trump were actually, the policies were much more favorable to Wall Street globalists and oligarchs. However, there were certain exceptions. And whereas Donald Trump and particularly Jair Bolsonaro did want to buck the capitalists on certain trade issues with China and Russia, they were not entirely successful because of, especially Bolsonaro, because the Brazilian capitalists are basically dependent and they do tremendous business and export of raw materials to communist China. And that's a very difficult nut to crack. So any future anti-communist movement has to break with this notion of being supportive of unrestrained corporate capitalism. We have to find a way somehow to connect with the anti-communist movements in Brazil, in the United States, and elsewhere. We have to liberate ourselves from the corporate capitalists. There are some corporate capitalists that are going to be good and worthy of us maintaining ties with and taking money from, ones that care about the working man, or ones that refuse to trade or do business with countries like China and Russia and other communist or Islamic countries. But they're the exception rather than the rule. So moving forward, we have to use our ingenuity as anti-communists and populists to liberate ourselves from the control of corporate capitalists who at every turn will hijack any anti-communist or bona fide populist revolution. So again, do not be fooled by the news media that'll term Trump or Bolsonaro or Boris Johnson as populists. They're not. They tend to be either typical Republicans in the case of Trump, with some exceptions, notable exceptions to his credit. And Bolsonaro is generally an American-style conservative, unfortunately guided by neoliberal market fundamentalists. And the same with Boris Johnson. He's a Thatcherite, as he has admitted himself. Those are not populists. Those are economic royalists, economic elitists, of which we adamantly pose here at the Patriotic Populists. The next book I was writing, a rather controversial book, authored by Andy Ngo, who is an investigative journalist on Antifa, which are basically this loosely organized coalition of anarcho-communist militants and borderline terrorists. And he wrote a book called Unmasked, and I found some interesting information in there. So those of you who are thinking that the country can have salvation from the left really are sorely mistaken. Many of these organizations of the left are not patriotic. They want to tear down the United States and overthrow our government. And look, Herschel and I are just as pissed off and disillusioned with our government. I mean, by first world standards, in many ways, America is a failed state by first world standards, but we still love our country. We don't want to see it go down in flames. We want to see a United States that's strengthened, that's the best possible country in the world. And that's what we want to restore. We want to restore the United States as a strong and powerful nation, not only militarily, but also spiritually, as in an organic national community. We want to see us strengthened economically, socially, more people having kids, the proliferation of nuclear families, and respect for diversity, with certain diversity within our national community. So getting back to the situation with Andy Ngo's book, some quotes. For example, a organization, the New York chapter of the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement, tweeted on June 2nd, 2020, we are on the verge of a global revolution that can finally rid the world of police along with the system of anti-blackness and capitalism they uphold. There you go. So that's Exhibit A. There's your Antifa. Okay, Exhibit B. Another Antifa group stated, militant networks will defend our revolutionary communities. Liberation begins where America dies. Okay, there you go. What more do you want? The left, the far left in this country, Antifa included, is not patriotic. They are traitors. Liberation begins where America dies. We can't collaborate with these people. We're patriotic. We are revolutionaries. But we are not. We are revolutionaries that are against the communist revolutionaries, and we're against the counter-revolutionaries of the Tea Party, the oligarchs, the Federalist Society, Conservative Incorporated, and their collaborators within the Democratic Party, the market fundamentalists, the Kristen Sinemas, and the Joe Manchins, for example. We are against all of those people. We are truly for a fourth position. And liberation begins where America dies, from the Antifa perspective, which is anarcho-communism, is totally unacceptable. It is a totally subversive, dangerous, traitorous, treasonous, tyrannical doctrine. We have no place, they have no place in our new United States that we seek, because they seek to extinguish all of the liberal freedoms that do help the nation progress as a free and prosperous country. So that's my opinion on Antifa. Now, the next item I wanted to discuss, the next book, is by Jeffrey Herf. The title is the Undeclared Wars with Israel. And that talks about how East Germany maintained very close ties with the various radical Arab states, radical Islamist and socialist states. Now, during the from the 1950s until 1990, late 1989, East Germany maintained very close ties with a variety of Arab socialist dictatorships at one stage or another, and they included Egypt under Nasser and Sadat, and even under Mubarak. They maintained ties with Gaddafi's Libya. They maintained ties with South Yemen, officially known as the People's Republic of Democratic Yemen, or the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, also known as South Yemen, which was at the time the Middle East's only official communist dictatorship. They maintained ties with the Islamist mullahs ruling Iran, with the Ba'athist socialist dictatorship in Syria under Hafez al-Assad, and then under Hafez al-Assad, and then also with Iraq under the Iraqi Ba'ath Socialist Party, first under Hassan Ahmed al-Bakr, and then his vice president Saddam Hussein, who then became president and dictator of Iraq in 1979. So this book really details it very well, by Jeffrey Herf. He is a scholar on Germany and Jews and anti-Semitism and whatnot. So I wanted to read a few little interesting things here that may be of use for everybody. And one thing was in particular, where Herf, I quote Herf saying, aside from agreements with the Soviet Union, the Eastern European members of the Warsaw Pact, China, Cuba, and Vietnam, the largest number of written agreements between East Germany and other states were with those with the Arab states. Now stop, just one moment. It mentioned China in there. Well, I thought there was a Sino-Soviet split. So you're telling me that China had military and intelligence agreements with East Germany during the Sino-Soviet split? I should say things that make you go, you know, how deep was this Sino-Soviet split? Here's also where it got also a little weirder. As of 1996, Germany had conducted negotiations about the following number of treaties with the Arab states: Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. The large number of treaties still in force with Egypt is surprising in view of its very... Okay, let me just open this up. And whoops, I got to rotate this around. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Public exit from the Soviet orbit. So that's very interesting. Very interesting. So what they're saying is, despite Egypt under Sadat exiting the Soviet orbit, at the same time, East Germany, as well as other communist countries, and I've written about this, maintain military ties with each other. East Germany and Sadat's Egypt and Mubarak's Egypt maintained military ties. Now, as we know, there were under the table agreements between Egypt under Sadat and Mubarak on the communist world, and Mubarak actually made a sincere effort to repair relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, he said to Gorbachev in one meeting, according to declassified transcripts as released by and smuggled out by Pavel Stroilov, that basically Egypt was collecting American aid so it could build itself up, and one day it will stab the imperialists in the back and publicly show itself as an enemy of the West, to basically paraphrase what was written. But there's also another thing too as well involved here. I wanted to read this newspaper article that was written in an Egyptian government-owned newspaper, and I think it really discusses really how Egypt would handle its relations with the United States and the Soviet Union. And I'm going to read this from my volume 2 of my latest book, Turning the Page. The strategy of a controlled, quote, break with the USSR was outlined by Lufti al-Kuli, who is a commentator for and publication, a government-owned, Egyptian government-owned newspaper publication called Al-Ahram. And it was a very revealing article. In that article, al-Kuli wrote, quote, U.S.-Israeli coordination is no longer total. In view of this, Egypt has decided that the political response to the new reality requires that Egyptian-Soviet coordination should also stop being total and be confined only to the general outlines. Otherwise, the Israeli-U.S. contradictions would not continue, and there would be, again, an Arab-Soviet front facing an Israeli-U.S. front. Egypt welcomes a certain degree of coordination with the Soviets, provided that the Soviet reaction does not exceed the limits of Egypt's visualization of the effect on mutual coordination between Tel Aviv and Washington. Very revealing. Very, very revealing. Because it's not showing, and this was at the time when Sadat unilaterally abrogated the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance with the Soviet Union in 1976. But what they're saying is that their prime goal is to basically heighten contradictions between Israel and the United States, which were already then revealing themselves. And Egypt's purpose was to, by drifting away from the Soviet bloc, they wanted to show themselves as an independent and therefore much more credible power. And that will give them leverage to get strategic territories captured by Israel back to them. And it would also allow Egypt to become a militarily powerful nation. So Egypt still was going to keep, this is an important, Al-Ahram is a very well-known government-owned publication in Egypt at that time, which was governed by the Arab Socialist Union, which was the ruling party. And again, it shows that Egypt was not rejecting a level of coordination with the communist bloc, but they were doing it on Egypt's terms, and in terms to make life for Israel hard and to heighten contradictions between the United States and Israel. So therefore, Egypt can kind of slack off and they can kind of loosen their ties with the Soviet Union and therefore gain credibility as, oh, Egypt's becoming independent. We're going to, the West and the United States is running, give them aid and all the rest of it. And therefore, Israel is going to be, pressured by the United States to sue for peace and to give up land to Israel and then later the Palestine Liberation Organization. And that's going to sap Israel's power. And that's essentially what was going on. Again, I'm going to read this article that Cooley wrote for Al Ahram on February 11, 1976. U.S.-Israeli coordination is no longer total, meaning the alliance is breaking apart. In view of this, Egypt has decided that the political response to the new reality requires that Egyptian-Soviet coordination should also stop being total and be confined only to the general outlines, meaning, support for various global liberation movements in Africa and Asia and in the Middle East, as well as general outlines where, we're going to be friendly with the Soviet Union and we generally agree with them on issues of imperialism and all the rest of it. The article continues, otherwise the U.S.-Israeli contradictions would not continue and there would be again an Arab-Soviet front facing an Israeli-U.S. front, which nothing changed because of the Arab-Soviet front and the Israeli-U.S. front. There was no military victory over Israel because then the United States would pour weapons into Israel, which finally Nixon did in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The article continues, Egypt welcomes a certain degree of coordination with the Soviets, provided that the Soviet reaction does not exceed the limits of Egypt's visualization of the effect on mutual coordination between Tel Aviv and Washington. So in other words, as relations were slowly breaking down between Israel and the United States, Egypt then could loosen its ties with the Soviet Union, but behind the scenes never totally break relations and coordination with Moscow. And I think that type of deals with East Germany played a part in that Moscow allowed its satellites and its allies, Yugoslavia, Romania, the USSR itself, with hidden shipments of spare parts and landing rights for Soviet Air Force transports, and military cooperation with East Germany and things of that nature. That's all part of that. Egypt is going to continue that, but it's going to be on the download. It's not going to be as close. And there was a strategic vision, a strategic reason for this. So this is where you got to be very careful of splits within the anti-imperialist camp, meaning the anti-Western states. Just because there's this appearance of broken relations or tensions, you got to look at both sides of the coin. You have to look at what can be gained from false splits. It all goes back to Sun Tzu, when you're strong, pretend you're weak. So you got to be very careful with these totalitarian socialists and Islamist powers. You got to be careful because they will pull the wool over the eyes of the Americans. And we have to be very careful with them. And we have to really think long and hard before sending weapons to them and conducting business with them. Very, very important. Now, another part I found interesting is the fact that, let me take a sip of my decaf coffee here, Folgers. Excuse me. Another thing is that under the so-called reformist East German government under Egon Krenz, who is the so-called reformist communist leader, well, you had ties between the various Palestinian extremist terrorist organizations continued between them. For example, on October 22nd, 1989, George Habash, who was the leader and founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, he wrote to Egon Krenz, who was the new East German dictator, took over from Erich Honecker and on October 18th, 1989. Habash wrote Krenz a letter to congratulate him on his appointment to the head of the East German Communist Party's Central Committee. So shows that the various hardline Moscow's clients and hardline elements of the Palestine terrorist organizations were still very, very supportive of the new so-called reformist communists in Germany. Habash was firmly convinced that the German communists would master the tasks facing them and strengthen the socialist construction of their country. Habash again expresses thanks for the quote unbroken and selfless assistance that the GDR has shown and shows to the just cause of our people and to the PLO, its sole legitimate representative. During the week of November 5th through the 11th, as the Berlin Wall was tumbling down, during the week of November 5th through the 11th, 1989, Wolfgang Krauss, the Deputy Secretary of the GDR's, which is East Germany, the name of East Germany, German Democratic Republic, Wolfgang Krauss, on November 5th through the 11th, 1989, the Deputy Secretary of the GDR's Solidarity Committee led an East German delegation to visit the PLO leadership at its headquarters in Tunis, which is the capital of Tunisia in North Africa. He learned that the PLO's leaders were deeply worried about events taking place in Eastern Europe and East Germany. On November 9th, the Berlin Wall was open and 40 years of one-party communist dictatorship was in the process of falling apart. Krauss reported the following. Let me read there. Krauss assured Yasser Arafat, who is the chairman of the PLO, and the other PLO leaders that, quote, the friendship and solidarity of the GDR with the Palestinian people and the PLO had a long tradition and deep roots in the GDR. Despite deep domestic changes in the GDR, that friendship and solidarity would certainly continue. So it shows again that despite all of these problems, in East Germany, where you had, despite the support of the Soviet Union, Egon Krentz's government in East Germany was facing quite a bit of problems, and the Soviet Union, of course, staged managed an operation in December of 1989 to have Krentz's government replaced by Hans Moldau, who was another reformist communist. But in the interim, this shows that at least East Germany under Egon Krenz, despite its reformist image, was still interested in maintaining ties with Palestinian extremist organizations like the PLO and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So that's very important to understand these reformist communists, that they were still committed, at least in theory and somewhat in practice, to supporting organizations that were diametrically opposed to American and Western interests. All righty, so now we're going to get rid of Jeffrey Herf's book, and now we're going to go to Chinese Spies. This is a book by Roger Falagot. He wrote actually 2 editions of this, and this book actually goes quite a bit into, I'm just going to summarize the most recent edition of Chinese Spies by Roger Falagot. It talks about how, for example, the Chinese Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army, they had, bases of operation in Ceausescu's Romania, and they also had bases of operations in Yugoslavia in the last years of the dictatorship of Marshal Joseph Broz Tito, who was the Yugoslav communist dictator. And despite the images of independence given by the Yugoslav and Romanian communists, in reality they were much more firmly entrenched in the Soviet camp and in Soviet strategic planning in regards to military operations, espionage, and foreign policy. And these ties between Yugoslavia continued well into the 1990s after the collapse of Yugoslavia. Under Slobodan Milosevic, you had between Slobodan Milosevic's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the Serbian government, that was just basically a successor communist government there, essentially. What happened was that the Yugoslav State Security and the Chinese Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army's intelligence departments, they continue to maintain close coordination with Milosevic's dictatorship. That's very, very, very important to understand that. China had a base of operations in Eastern Europe throughout the 1990s and backed the bloodthirsty Milosevic dictatorship. So that's really, really important. And Roger Falaget's book on titled Chinese Spies really kind of goes into that. And that's very, very useful, for people learning about the relations between, the People's Republic of China, as well as Yugoslavia under Tito and then under Milosevic. So they really go quite a bit into detail about that. It's really a must read about that. So let me just go through a couple of things. This book also, Chinese Spies by Roger Falagat, it also discusses quite a bit about how the Chinese in 1989 were developing close relations with the East Germans, as East Germany was facing unrest too as well. Again, it shows that the Sino-Soviet split really could only go so far, that it really was not, it was, at best, it was exaggerated by those in the West who were hoping for a weakening in the communist camp, when in reality, on issues of common concern, the Chinese and the Russians and the Russian allies would often come together too as well. The book Chinese Spies by Roger Falagat, it also discusses a tremendous amount of coordination between the Russian intelligence under Yeltsin and Putin and the Chinese intelligence services under, of course, the control of the Chinese Communist Party. The coordination was very real between the Russian SVR and the Chinese Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army's Intelligence Directorate. So that's really important. I highly recommend this book by Roger Falagat. There's a lot of information in there. It talks about how the Chinese military and the Cuban military were developing ties starting at the end of the late 1990s. Although I found information that as early as 1989, the Chinese and the Cuban militaries were developing contacts even as far back as the 1980s, actually. I found that in other sources, but by the late 1990s and into the 2000s, that the Cuban and Chinese military intelligence services forged very close ties. The book points out how the Chinese established themselves in Lourdes and Bajikal, which were electronic and communications monitoring bases that monitored American communications and the American military. It also talks about how Chinese naval vessels were visiting Cuban ports, and even Chinese nuclear submarines were occasionally making visits and basing in Cienfuegos, which is, I believe, in the southern part of Cuba. It's a city, and where the Russians, the Soviets, also had at one time their nuclear ballistic missile submarines as well. So definitely something to watch. The book Chinese Spies by Roger Falagat, excellent book. I really recommend it. The full title, Chinese Spies from Chairman Mao to Xi Jinping, written by Roger Falagat, Faligot. Really good book. One of the several good books out there on the Chinese intelligence services and how China is increasing its power. Now, the next book, I had a lot of very good information by Redchenko. The title is Unwanted Visionaries, and that talks about Gorbachev's attempt to develop a sort of united anti-American front in Asia. And this author had some very interesting quotes by various Soviet ideologists and Soviet officials regarding American cooperation with China. It was very interesting because it really showed that China was not doing it because they loved the United States or they loved capitalism. So we're going to read a few things here. Let me just find. Okay. Okay, here's an interesting passage from this book. On October 2nd, 1980, the Soviet Politburo discussed military cooperation between China and the United States and passed a resolution to counteract this cooperation by explaining through Soviet ambassadors posted overseas what China's long-term designs really were and how the naive Americans had been taken in by China's anti-Soviet stand. Being realistic, one should recognize that a strong China will probably choose a different direction uh, for its expansionist plans. It will swallow neighboring countries, take over regions vital to the entire world. It will not serve as a instrument in the hands of the USA or some other country. And that's very interesting. That comes from the Politburo resolution of October 1980. And what's significant about that, it shows that China is really not a true friend of the United States. And the Soviets knew that all along. And yet, of course, what's interesting is back then, the Soviets were also attempting to, quote, heal the split. The Soviets were signing trade agreements with China that included exports of strategic goods to China. And it also, on a whole host of issues, the Chinese were more and more taking the side of the Soviet Union in various conflicts throughout the globe. To give you some examples, the Chinese and the Soviets were both backing the Iranians, the Iraqis, they were backing South Yemen, they were backing Mozambique, they withdrew support from UNITA and the FNLA groups in Angola, and they were starting to back the MPLA. So the list goes on and on and on. So it's very important. Soviets knew that the Chinese were not all of a sudden loving America and loving capitalism. And I think that's important for us to know. This whole notion of the split really was to build up China. It was not to serve, as other documents have shown, to serve as just a stick to beat over the Soviet head. Now there's some more here. Mikhail Kapitza, he was a deputy foreign minister in the Soviet Union, and it was very interesting what it mentioned here about China. Let me just try and read through this here. So, okay, let me just, thanks for bearing with me. Okay, as Kapitza said, and he was a Soviet deputy foreign minister at the time, he said, in foreign policy, China's alignment with the United States was only temporary because the Chinese, quote, wish to modernize their economy using Western technological help and credits and have no other capital to pay for this help but anti-Sovietism. There you go. Soviet Union was just a card to get the Western technology. And might I add, according to a defector from the Vietnamese puppet Cambodian communist government, a defector charged in 1989 revealed that it was Kapitza who recommended that the Cambodian puppets and the Vietnamese enter into negotiations with the Khmer Rouge communist oppositionists, which were backed by China. Why? Kapitza said if the Vietnamese and the Cambodians make peace with the Khmer Rouge, then that would get China on the side of Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Soviet Union. And that would mean that with China, we could neutralize and isolate the United States. And Kapitza actually said that. So very interesting. Soviets really knew that China's purpose to get that technology had nothing to do with the fact they like capitalism or they like Presidents Carter or Reagan or Nixon. Had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with China building itself as a premier communist power to ultimately overtake the world, and perhaps in cooperation with Moscow. So let's see what else we have. Excuse me. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Just got to read these different things here. And the United States, even under President Carter, as we're reading in Redchenko's book, they were concerned by Mike Oxenberg and David Aaron. They were concerned that about China playing a Soviet card against the United States. Okay, so that was some interesting things on China. Now, another thing, Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, the saint, the reformer, the best thing since sliced bread in the annals of the history of international communism. Now, Gorbachev, one of the initial strategic plans that Gorbachev wanted to do was he wanted to create an alliance with Asia that would consist of the Soviet Union, pro-Soviet India under Rajiv Gandhi and China. In fact, Gorbachev was excited to push India further in the Soviet camp in order for it to, quote, free itself from imperialist pressure. At a Politburo meeting on December 4th, 1986, days after his return from India, Gorbachev, the great, the wonderful, the reformer, the Christian, the guy who got disillusioned with communists, well, he outlined various strategic and geopolitical reasons for why close ties with India were all important with the USSR. The Indian Ocean, Gorbachev said, the U.S. is settled here. Then there was Pakistan, U.S. ally. Here, India is our natural ally. India is a key link in our Asian policy. In a word, Gorbachev summarized, we cannot say aloud the word ally with regard to India, but we should take the matters in that direction. So that's the thing. And he wanted to join the two arch enemies, India and China, together to create a sort of anti-imperialist, anti-American alliance that would neutralize American power in the Indian Ocean region, really in all of East Asia. And this is in the book by Redchenko. Very important. Just going through and just seeing if I can find any other, quotes here. I'm just trying to summarize everything. So I appreciate everyone's patience. Okay, as Gorbachev explained to the Portuguese Communist Party leader Alvaro Cunhal, the Americans are, quote, carefully worrying what is happening in the Asia Pacific. They're literally sensing signs of improvement in Sino-Soviet relations or rapprochement between the USSR and India. They are doing everything possible to prevent the creation of such a triangle in Asia. Indeed, over 2 billion people live in these countries, the USSR, India, and China. They have huge potential. There you go. So again, Gorbachev, the great, the wonderful, the saint, was trying to isolate the United States. That's the bottom line. Let me repeat it again. According to, as Gorbachev explained to Portuguese leader Alvaro Cunhal, the Americans are carefully waiting what is happening in the Asia Pacific. They're literally shaking over the signs of improvement in Sino-Soviet relations and rapprochement between the USSR and India. They're doing everything possible to prevent let me just find this here, to prevent the creation of such a triangle in Asia. Indeed, over 2 billion people live in the three countries, USSR, India, and China. They have huge potential. At the Politburo, the Soviet leader concluded with disappointment, the triangle USSR, India, China will not work for now. The main resistance is from India. There, China is an obsessive idea. It's not for nothing that we're improving relations with PRC. We are prodding India to do the same. At this time, the best position the Soviet Union could adopt was we must not knock them, China and India, head to head. So really and truly, Moscow was trying to forge this united front, again, India and China against American interests. Here again, even the forerunner of the BRICS alliance. The idea of a triangle continued to haunt the Soviet leader over the following months. He returned to it during the next visit to India in November 1988. Gandhi was more open to the idea on this occasion, seeing it as a means for opposing, quote, the challenge of the US EEC Japan grouping. EEC is the European Economic Community, later the European Union. Gorbachev, after his recent meetings with the Brazilian president, enthused to Gandhi, Brazil is striving to join this USSR, India, China triangle. It is literally knocking at the door. But the early prototype of the Brazil, Russia, India, China grouping, or BRICS alliance, continued to suffer from Sino-Indian disagreements. Discussing the results of his visit at the Politburo on November 24th, 1988, Gorbachev said, quote, China is a problem for Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India. Socialist prime minister and pro-Soviet. I told him about the triangle, India, China, USSR. It seemed like he met this idea with applause, but I asked him about the border with the PRC. His response was, it seems as if it was settled, but we did not become friends. So there you go. There you go. Even though it was breaking apart and there were problems with the alliance, the fact of the matter is Gorbachev wanted to develop this massive coalition in the mid to late 1980s to challenge American power. And it seems like this is potentially the seeds, the origins for the BRICS alliance, which exists today, particularly when Brazil was under control of Lula da Silva, who was a Marxist and the leader and founder of the Workers' Party, Communist China, and Russia under United Russian Party and the crypto-communist Putin, and then India too as well, if it could ever get back into the more socialist-leaning Congress Party. Right now it's under this control of this sort of right-wing neoliberal market fundamentalist Modi. I'm just trying to see if I can find any more little tidbits here. Even Gorbachev had a conversation with a Mongolian communist delegation in May 1990 and July 1990 with the new Indian Premier VP Singh, also I believe of the socialist-leaning Congress Party. Seems to me that our common efforts to allow us to attain a new level of relations is an exceptionally important triangle, the Soviet Union, India, China. I think this great process has only now began to unfold. If we show a responsible approach patience and friendly relations to each other. New helpful perspectives will open here, which will have a beneficial influence on the development of the situation, not only here, but all over everywhere in the world. Singh agreed far more, saying that India is deeply interested in the development of a dialogue and trilateral cooperation with China. So there you go. So even Gorbachev, even after the slow collapse in Eastern Europe, Gorbachev is still interested in creating an alliance between the Soviet Union, China, and India, even in 1990, which would implicitly challenge the hegemony of the United States and its Asian allies. So again, whether these programs of Gorbachev failed is irrelevant. It's important to show that Gorbachev is not this guy who all of a sudden loved America and just, was lost faith in the Soviet Union. He was committed to, friendlier relations with the United States. No, his intentions was to continue to displace American power. He just did it with a friendlier smile and fooled a lot more people. And this is why, historically, as we look at events as they unfold, if China all of a sudden, a new communist leader who's younger and has a nicer smile than Xi Jinping comes along, or someone in Russia, is this sort of whiz kid, young member of the United Russia Party, don't trust them. You have to do your due diligence and really assume that the Russian and Chinese governments, even today, will utilize deception to create new glasnost, new perestroika, but at the same time to neutralize American power through psychological warfare and propaganda. Never trust communist governments, never trust communist-style governments or governments and dictatorships that are based on this sort of communist pedigree of engaging in politics. Never trust them. Well, everyone, I'd like to thank you all for joining me for this live stream. I really appreciate it. Happy to do this once again. In the next coming weeks, we have some guests lined up. Right now, I lined up J.R. Nyquist, who's really the premier geopolitical expert who is an expert on Russia and China and other national security matters and threats that the United States faces. He's really good at what he does. There are some major disagreements I've had with him on some of the things he's written, but on and all, he's an excellent analyst, and him and I are going to talk quite a bit about geopolitics. We'll probably talk about economics, domestic policy. We'll go over maybe some of the things we disagree with, but I think it's going to be a fun and productive group of discussions. As for me, had a great weekend, spent time with my daughter. On Saturday, met one of her new friends. We went thrift stores, bought a few items, and then a small present for my girlfriend, who the past few weeks I've been seeing. And an amazing person. She makes me so happy. It's like a dream miracle come true. Her and I had a wonderful day at the beach. We have a lot in common, including political interests, exercise. She looks wonderful, but more importantly, has a wonderful heart, she's a wonderful mother, hard worker. She is Latina. She's originally from Cuba, and I really care about her very, very deeply, and I love spending time with her. And so a little update on me, all is well, and all is good in life, and I hope everybody has a great week. And we'll be returning tomorrow night for the first of a series of interviews with geopolitical expert and analyst J.R. Nyquist. Thank you all.